Such is the psychology of people who listen to music to focus on tasks. You see them everywhere. Headphones on before the laptop even opens. Spotify loading before the first word is written. A carefully curated playlist for every task, every mood, every fragment of productivity they're trying to manufacture. They tell themselves it helps them focus. And maybe it does. But watch them closely. Watch what happens when the music stops unexpectedly, when the battery dies or the connection drops. Watch the immediate discomfort, the reaching for the phone, the urgency to restore the soundscape. That's not focus. That's dependency. Because here's what nobody admits. The music isn't helping them concentrate on the task. The music is helping them avoid what rises up in silence. The thoughts they don't want to think. The feelings they don't want to feel. The voice inside that says things they'd rather not hear. Such is the psychology that mistakes auditory distraction for mental clarity. They've built an entire productivity system around never being alone with their own mind. The morning routine includes choosing the right playlist. The work session is defined by which album will accompany it. The quality of their output becomes mysteriously tied to whether the algorithm served them the perfect background noise. And beneath this elaborate structure lives a simple, terrifying truth. I cannot be with myself in silence. Not for an hour. Often not for 15 minutes. Sometimes not even for the length of time it takes to write a single paragraph. The music fills the space where their thoughts would otherwise live. And they've convinced themselves this filling is necessary. That silence is the enemy of productivity. That focus requires a soundtrack. But what if it's the opposite? What if the music isn't enabling focus but replacing it with something else entirely? The pattern reveals itself in the dependencies they don't acknowledge. They have different playlists for different tasks. Focus music, deep work music, creative flow music. As if the external soundscape can somehow generate the internal state they're seeking. As if concentration is something that can be downloaded and played through speakers. And it works, doesn't it? Most of the time it works. But watch what happens when they try to work without it. The sudden awareness of every ambient sound. The ticking clock, the distant traffic, the hum of the refrigerator. Sounds that were always there but are suddenly unbearable because there's nothing to mask them. More accurately, because there's nothing to mask the internal noise. Psychologist Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi studied flow states, those moments of complete absorption where the self disappears and only the task remains. And he found that flow emerges from a delicate balance between challenge and skill, between attention and engagement. Notice what's not required: music. Flow happens in silence as easily as it happens in sound. But people who depend on music to work have often lost access to the kind of attention that can generate flow naturally. They've outsourced their capacity for focus to an external stimulus, and now they can't retrieve it without that stimulus present. This is called cognitive scaffolding. The mind learns to rely on environmental supports and eventually forgets how to function without them. Such is the psychology that traded natural attention for manufactured concentration and called it optimization. And here's where the real problem emerges. They're not just avoiding silence, they're avoiding themselves. Because in silence, thoughts arrive uninvited, anxieties surface, doubts whisper. The task in front of them suddenly seems impossible or meaningless. And rather than developing the capacity to work through those thoughts, they've developed the habit of drowning them out. The music becomes a buffer between consciousness and self-consciousness, between doing and doubting, between action and the paralysis that comes from thinking too much about the action. But paralysis avoided isn't paralysis overcome. It's just paralysis postponed. The origins run deeper than preference or productivity hacks. Freud understood that the psyche develops defense mechanisms to protect itself from unbearable reality: repression, denial, displacement. And for many, music has become a socially acceptable form of dissociation, not the clinical kind, the everyday kind. The gentle disconnection from internal experience that allows them to function without confronting what's actually happening inside. Donald Winnicott wrote about the capacity to be alone as a developmental milestone. The infant who learns that they can exist in the presence of the mother without constant stimulation develops what he called the capacity for solitude. This capacity becomes the foundation for genuine creativity, for authentic thought, for the kind of work that emerges from deep internal resources. But what happens to the child who learned that silence is uncomfortable, that being alone with their thoughts feels dangerous, that the mind, left to its own devices, generates anxiety rather than insight? They grow into adults who need constant auditory input, who feel naked without headphones, who describe silence as too loud. Carl Jung spoke of the shadow, the repressed and hidden parts of the self. And for many, silence threatens to reveal the shadow. The music keeps it at bay, keeps the focus external, keeps the attention on the task and away from the internal landscape they've been avoiding for years. But the shadow doesn't disappear. It just waits. Such is the psychology that learned early that the inside of their head is not a safe place to be. And this learning happened quietly. Perhaps a parent who dismissed their concerns. Stop overthinking. Stop worrying so much. Perhaps a series of experiences where introspection led to pain rather than understanding. Perhaps a nervous system that runs hot, where thoughts spiral easily into anxiety and music provides the regulation they couldn't develop internally. Or perhaps something simpler. They discovered, accidentally, that music makes hard things easier. That calculus homework becomes bearable with the right soundtrack. That writing essays feels less daunting with instrumental background noise. And what began as a helpful tool became a necessary crutch. And here's the mechanism that keeps them trapped in the pattern. Every time they choose music over silence, they reinforce the neural pathway that says, "I need this to function." Every time they can't start work without the perfect playlist, they weaken the muscle of natural attention. Every time they avoid the discomfort of silence, they confirm the belief that silence is unbearable. Behavioral psychology demonstrates that avoidance behaviors become stronger through negative reinforcement. The anxiety drops when the music starts, and that relief becomes the reward. The pattern deepens, the dependency calcifies. But here's what they don't see. They're not avoiding external distraction. They're avoiding internal presence. The music doesn't block out the world. It blocks out the self. The commentary, the judgment, the constant evaluation of whether they're doing it right, fast enough, well enough. The music creates a thin barrier between the task and the anxious narrator who undermines every attempt at focus. And in that sense, the music works brilliantly. But it's also making them more fragile, because they're not learning to quiet that voice. They're just learning to drown it out. And the voice, like anything ignored, grows louder over time, which means they need the music louder, more constant, more carefully curated. The dependency deepens while pretending to be productivity. Such is the psychology that confused numbing with focus. Philosopher Blaise Pascal wrote that all of humanity's problems stem from our inability to sit quietly in a room alone. And he was right, though he couldn't have imagined how many tools we developed to avoid that sitting. Music, podcasts, audiobooks, anything to fill the space where thoughts would otherwise live. They tell themselves they're multitasking, optimizing, making use of the time. But multitasking is a myth. What they're actually doing is splitting their attention between the task and the distraction, and calling the resulting fragmentation focus. Neuroscientist Daniel Levitin's research shows that the brain cannot actually process two streams of complex information simultaneously. When we think we're multitasking, we're actually rapidly switching attention between tasks, and each switch costs cognitive resources. Music with lyrics is particularly insidious because the language processing centers of the brain are trying to work on the writing while also processing the words in the song. The conflict is subtle enough that they don't notice it, but present enough that it degrades the quality of both the writing and the listening. And yet they persist, because the alternative, silence, feels worse. But something shifts when they're forced to confront the dependency. Perhaps the headphones break. Perhaps they're in an environment where music isn't allowed. Perhaps someone comments on how they can never seem to work without the constant soundtrack. And in that moment, they're face to face with what they've been avoiding, the raw experience of trying to focus without the buffer. The thoughts arrive immediately. This is uncomfortable. I can't do this. I need the music. This isn't working. And beneath those thoughts, something more honest. I don't know how to be with myself. This is the crack in the armor, the moment when the pattern becomes visible as a pattern rather than just how I work best. Viktor Frankl taught that between stimulus and response there is a space, and in that space lies our freedom to choose. But people who fill every moment with music have eliminated that space. The silence that should exist between thought and action has been colonized by external sound. When they reclaim that space, even briefly, something unexpected happens. Not peace, not immediate improvement, but awareness. Awareness that the anxiety they've been managing with music doesn't disappear when the music starts. It just becomes less noticeable. Awareness that the focus they attribute to the playlist might actually be their own capacity, which they've learned to access only through this specific ritual. Such is the psychology that discovers the crutch was holding them up, but also holding them back. This doesn't mean music is the enemy. It means the dependency on music reveals something about their relationship with their own attention, their own thoughts, their own capacity to be present with discomfort. And that revelation is uncomfortable, because it suggests they've been running from something they'll eventually have to face. The inside of their own head, exactly as it is, without modification or mediation. Integration doesn't mean forcing themselves into silence or abandoning music entirely. It means getting honest about what the music is actually doing, not what they tell themselves it's doing. Not the story about focus and productivity, but the truth beneath that story. For some, music genuinely enhances certain types of work. Repetitive tasks, physical labor, activities that don't require complex language processing. This is legitimate and supported by research. But for others, the music is compensating for an inability to self-regulate, an inability to sit with discomfort, an inability to generate the internal conditions for focus without external support. And distinguishing between these two requires brutal honesty. James Hollis writes about living the unlived life, the parts of ourselves we've avoided or repressed. And for many, the unlived life includes the capacity for sustained attention in silence, the ability to think without distraction, the courage to face the thoughts that arise when there's nothing to drown them out. This capacity doesn't develop through force, it develops through practice. Small increments of silence, 5 minutes of work without music, then 10, then 15. Not as punishment, but as experiment. What happens in that silence? What thoughts arise? What feelings emerge? What does the anxious voice say when there's no music to compete with it? And here's the paradox. By listening to that voice rather than drowning it out, it often quiets naturally. The anxiety that seemed unbearable becomes bearable. The thoughts that seemed overwhelming become manageable. The silence that felt empty becomes spacious. Such is the psychology that discovers the thing they were running from was never as dangerous as the running itself. This doesn't happen quickly. The dependency runs deep, carved into neural pathways through years of repetition. But it can change, slowly, incrementally, through the willingness to be uncomfortable and curious rather than comfortable and avoidant. Pema Chodron teaches that the root of suffering is trying to avoid discomfort. And the music, for all its benefits, has become a sophisticated avoidance strategy. Not consciously malicious, just human. The natural impulse to move away from pain and toward pleasure. But growth lives in the space between. In the willingness to sit with what is, even when what is feels difficult or empty or too loud inside their head. Understanding doesn't erase the need for music, but it does reveal what the need is actually for. They can keep the playlists, keep the ritual of choosing the right soundtrack, keep the habit that served them in its way for years. But now they know what they're doing. They're not optimizing focus. They're managing discomfort. They're creating conditions where work feels possible because the alternative, silence, feels impossible. And that's okay. That's human. But it's also a limitation they can work with rather than deny. A pattern they can slowly reshape rather than defend. A dependency they can loosen without completely abandoning. The music doesn't have to disappear. But maybe gradually the desperate need for it can. Maybe they can learn to work in silence for short periods. Maybe they can discover that focus without music feels different but not worse. Maybe they can develop the capacity to choose music rather than need it. Rainer Maria Rilke wrote about living the questions, not forcing answers, but dwelling in the uncertainty long enough for something true to emerge. What if the music isn't the question? What if the question is, why am I so afraid of my own thoughts? That question doesn't have an easy answer. It opens into history, into wounds, into patterns so old they feel like personality traits rather than learned responses. But it's the right question, the one that leads somewhere real. Such is the psychology of those who filled every silence with sound and called it productivity. They're beginning to see the difference between genuine focus and managed avoidance, between helpful tool and necessary crutch, between preference and dependency. And that seeing changes everything. Not all at once, not dramatically, but slowly. They're reclaiming their attention, learning to sit with discomfort, discovering that the thoughts they've been drowning out aren't as dangerous as they feared. The music can stay, the playlist can remain, the headphones can still be their companion, but now occasionally they take them off and sit in silence and work anyway. And the voice inside their head, the one they've been avoiding, starts to sound less like an enemy and more like something that deserves to be heard. Not agreed with, not obeyed, just heard. And in that hearing, something loosens. The grip of the dependency, the fear of silence, the belief that they need external sound to access internal capacity. They're learning what they should have known all along. The focus was always theirs. The music just made it feel safer to access. Such is the psychology that discovers the silence they feared might be the peace they need. The headphones are there when they want them, but they're learning they don't always need them. And that small shift is everything.